Kearney County, Nebraska, September 14, 1986. The smell of diesel fuel and fresh corn filled the air at Hartwell's farm supply as 23-year-old Rebecca "Becky" Morrison loaded 50-pound sacks of feed into the back of her blue Ford pickup truck. The autumn harvest was in full swing, and the small farming community of Minden buzzed with the familiar rhythm of tractors and grain elevators working overtime. Becky wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her work gloves, her blonde hair catching the late afternoon sunlight that filtered through the oak trees lining Main Street. She had worked at the county extension office for 2 years since graduating from the University of Nebraska, helping local farmers with crop rotation advice and soil testing. Everyone in Minden knew Becky. She was the kind of person who remembered your children's names and always brought homemade cookies to church potlucks. Her cheerful demeanor and genuine interest in people's lives made her a beloved figure in the tight-knit community of 2,800 residents. "Tell your folks I said hello," called out Jim Hartwell as Becky climbed into her truck. The engine turned over with a familiar rumble, and she waved through the open window before pulling onto Highway 10. Her next stop was the Patterson farm, about 12 miles southeast of town, where she needed to collect soil samples for next season's planting recommendations. The 2-lane road stretched endlessly through golden cornfields, punctuated by red barns and white farmhouses set back from the road. Radio station KRVN played Dolly Parton's 9 to 5 as Becky tapped her fingers on the steering wheel, thinking about her weekend plans. She was supposed to meet her boyfriend, Danny Sullivan, at the Harvest Festival dance on Saturday night. They had been talking about getting engaged after dating for 3 years. At 4:47 p.m., according to the gas station receipt found later in her truck, Becky stopped at Murphy's Corner Store, a small convenience store at the intersection of Highway 10 and County Road 15. Store owner Margaret Murphy remembered serving her a Diet Coke and a pack of gum. Becky seemed in good spirits, mentioning she was running late for her appointment at the Patterson farm. She was always punctual, Margaret would later tell investigators, never late for anything. That's why I thought it was odd when she said she was behind schedule. The Patterson farm sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by recently harvested soybean fields. When Becky failed to arrive by 5:30 p.m. as scheduled, Eleanor Patterson called the extension office. By 7 p.m., when Becky still hadn't returned home for dinner with her parents, worry began to creep through the Morrison household, like cold air through a crack in the wall. Her father, Robert Morrison, drove the route between town and the Patterson farm twice that evening, his headlights cutting through the growing darkness. The gravel road was empty except for the occasional rabbit darting across the path. There was no sign of Becky's blue Ford pickup anywhere along the familiar stretch of countryside. By midnight, the Kearney County Sheriff's Department had officially opened a missing person case. Becky Morrison, a young woman who had never spent a night away from home without telling her parents exactly where she would be, had simply vanished somewhere between Murphy's corner store and the Patterson farm, a distance of less than 8 miles through the heart of rural Nebraska. The silence of that September night felt different to those who knew Becky best. It wasn't just the absence of her laughter or her voice calling out greetings to neighbors. It was the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in their small world, leaving behind only questions that would echo through the community for decades to come. October 1986, March 1987. The search for Rebecca Morrison began at dawn on September 15th, just 14 hours after her parents first realized she was missing. Sheriff Dale Kowalski coordinated efforts with the Nebraska State Patrol, organizing volunteers into search teams that would comb every field, barn, and abandoned building within a 20-mile radius of Minden. More than 300 volunteers showed up that first morning, farmers who left their harvest work, teachers who called in substitutes, even teenagers who skipped school to help find the girl everyone called the Sunshine of Minden. They formed lines across cornfields, walking shoulder to shoulder through rows of stubble, calling Becky's name until their voices grew hoarse. The sound of her name echoed across the vast Nebraska landscape, but only the wind answered back. Danny Sullivan barely spoke during those first weeks. Friends found him sitting on the courthouse steps at all hours, staring down Main Street as if he could will Becky's blue truck to appear around the corner. His mother, Rose Sullivan, brought him sandwiches he wouldn't eat and coffee that grew cold in his hands. "She'll come back," he would whisper to anyone who would listen. Becky always comes back. The investigation quickly focused on the 8-mile stretch between Murphy's corner store and the Patterson farm. Becky's truck was found 3 days later, parked neatly on the shoulder of County Road 15, approximately 2 miles from her intended destination. The vehicle was locked, keys nowhere to be found. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet intact with $43 in cash. The soil testing equipment she needed for the Patterson appointment remained untouched in the truck bed. State investigators processed the pickup truck for evidence, but found nothing unusual, no signs of struggle, no foreign fingerprints, no indication of foul play. It was as if Becky had simply stepped out of her truck and walked away, leaving behind her entire life without explanation. Detective Warren Hayes from the State Patrol spent countless hours interviewing everyone who knew Becky. Her co-workers described a dedicated young professional who loved her job and was planning her future with Danny. Her family painted a picture of a responsible daughter who called if she was going to be even 15 minutes late. Teachers from her high school years remembered a student who was involved in everything: 4-H, student council, church youth group, and had never been in any kind of trouble. There was no reason for Becky to run away. Her mother, Carol Morrison, told investigators through tears. She was happy. She loved her life here. She was talking about wedding plans just last week. As weeks turned to months, the initial surge of community support began to show cracks. Search parties grew smaller. Conversations at the Munden Cafe gradually returned to discussions of weather and grain prices rather than theories about what might have happened to Becky. The yellow ribbons tied to trees throughout the county began to fade and fray in the winter wind. The Morrison family aged visibly during those months. Robert Morrison's hair turned completely grey, and he developed a habit of driving past the spot where Becky's truck was found, sometimes multiple times a day. Carol Morrison threw herself into organizing search efforts and maintaining contact with law enforcement, creating detailed charts and timelines that covered an entire wall of their kitchen. By spring of 1987, Sheriff Kowalski admitted privately that they had exhausted all leads. The case remained officially open, but active investigation had essentially stopped. The Nebraska State Patrol moved Detective Hayes to other cases. The volunteers who had searched so diligently now focused on planting season and their own families' needs. Danny Sullivan finally accepted a job offer in Omaha and left Minden in March 1987, unable to bear the weight of memories and unanswered questions that seemed to live in every corner of the small town. Before leaving, he placed a single white rose on the courthouse steps, where he had spent so many sleepless nights waiting for news that never came. The silence that settled over Minden in the wake of Becky's disappearance was different from the peaceful quiet of rural life. It was a silence filled with unspoken fears, whispered theories, and the growing realization that sometimes people simply vanish without explanation, leaving behind only the echo of their absence and the terrible knowledge that evil can touch even the most innocent places. Becky Morrison's name would continue to appear in the Kearney County Tribune's annual review of unsolved cases, but as years passed, the column grew shorter and shorter until it was just a single line. The disappearance of Rebecca Morrison, 1986, remains under investigation. Kearney County, Nebraska, August 15, 2019. The drought of 2019 was the worst Nebraska had seen in 40 years. Corn withered in fields that normally stretched green to the horizon, and ranchers hauled water to livestock in trucks that kicked up clouds of dust visible for miles. The little Blue River, which had meandered through Kearney County for thousands of years, dwindled to isolated pools connected by cracked mud channels that hadn't seen water since late spring. Marcus Chen, a graduate student in archaeology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, had been documenting historical sites exposed by the receding waters as part of his master's thesis on 19th-century settlement patterns. Armed with a metal detector and GPS unit, he methodically surveyed areas that had been underwater for decades, uncovering forgotten fence posts, old farming equipment, and occasionally artifacts from the area's pioneer days. The morning heat was already oppressive at 8 a.m. when Marcus parked his Honda Civic on the shoulder of County Road 15, about 3 miles southeast of Minden. The dried riverbed stretched before him like a moonscape, cracked earth forming geometric patterns that crunched under his boots. Cottonwood trees that normally shaded the water's edge now stood like sentinels guarding empty channels, their roots exposed and reaching into air instead of river bottom. Marcus had been working for about 2 hours, finding nothing more interesting than rusted cans and broken bottles, when his metal detector began emitting a strong, steady signal near what had once been a deep pool beneath a railroad trestle. The sound was different from the usual scatter of small metal debris, more focused, more substantial. He knelt in the dried mud and began carefully brushing away layers of accumulated sediment with a soft, bristled brush. The first thing he uncovered was a tarnished silver chain, delicate and thin. As he continued to excavate the small area, more items emerged. A class ring from Minden High School, dated 1981, and a set of car keys attached to a small leather keychain shaped like a cowboy boot. But it was the final item that made Marcus sit back on his heels and reach for his cell phone with trembling fingers. Partially buried beneath the other objects was a Nebraska driver's license, the plastic yellowed and warped but still readable. The photo showed a young woman with blonde hair and a bright smile. The name read, Rebecca Morrison, expiration date, September 14, 1990. Marcus had lived in Nebraska his entire life, and like most residents, he knew the story of Becky Morrison's disappearance. It was one of those cases that parents still mentioned when warning their children about safety. One of those mysteries that true crime enthusiasts discussed on internet forums and small-town coffee shops alike. He carefully photographed each item exactly where he found them, then called the Kearney County Sheriff's Department. The current sheriff, Jennifer Walsh, who had been a rookie deputy when Becky disappeared, arrived within 30 minutes, accompanied by 2 state crime scene technicians who happened to be in the area working another case. 33 years, Sheriff Walsh said quietly as she stared at the driver's license. For 33 years, and here they are, just sitting in a dried-up riverbed like they were waiting for someone to find them. The items were carefully collected and documented. The location was approximately 2.8 miles from where Becky's truck had been found in 1986, in a section of the river that would have been underwater and moving at the time of her disappearance. The depth of burial suggested the items had been there for decades, gradually covered by sediment during flood seasons and preserved by the river's normally consistent water level. Word of the discovery spread through Minden faster than a grass fire. Within hours, pickup trucks and cars lined County Road 15 as curious residents came to see the spot where Becky's belongings had been found. Some brought flowers, others just stood silently at the edge of the dried riverbed, processing the reality that after more than 3 decades, Becky Morrison had reached out from the past to touch their lives once again. Carol Morrison, now 84 and living in a nursing home in Kearney, was among the first to be notified. Her daughter Linda, who had been 8 years old when Becky disappeared, later described her mother's reaction. She just held that photo of Becky's driver's license and cried. After all these years, she finally had proof that someone else knew what happened to her daughter. The discovery made national news. CNN, NBC, and dozens of other outlets picked up the story of the cold case that had been reopened by drought conditions. Retired Detective Warren Hayes, now 78 and living in Lincoln, told reporters, "I always believed those items would surface someday. Rivers have a way of giving up their secrets eventually." But the items raised as many questions as they answered. How had Becky's personal belongings ended up in the little blue river? Who had put them there, and why? Most importantly, if her driver's license and keys were in the riverbed, where was Becky Morrison? As news crews packed up their equipment and the crowds of curious onlookers dispersed, Marcus Chen stood alone at the edge of the dried riverbed as the sun set over the Nebraska prairie. He couldn't shake the feeling that Becky's belongings had been waiting in that exact spot for decades, preserved by water and time, holding their secrets until the right moment, until someone would listen to what they had to say. September 2019, January 2020. The renewed investigation into Rebecca Morrison's disappearance began with a simple observation from Marcus Chen. As he reviewed his photographs of the discovery site, something bothered him about the way the items were positioned. Unlike other debris scattered randomly by river currents, Becky's belongings had been found clustered together, almost as if they had been placed deliberately rather than washed downstream over time. Sheriff Jennifer Walsh assembled a task force that included Detective Sarah Martinez from the State Patrol's Cold Case Unit and FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Robert Fleming. They began by re-interviewing everyone still alive who had been connected to the original investigation, armed with new questions and 3 decades of advances in investigative techniques. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Gerald Jerry Hutchinson, now 67 and battling early-stage dementia, had been a maintenance worker for the County Road Department in 1986. His daughter brought him to the sheriff's office after he became agitated, watching news coverage of the discovery, repeatedly mumbling about the bridge and what happened to that girl. Detective Martinez spent hours with Jerry, using techniques designed to help dementia patients access older memories that often remained intact even as recent memory faded. Gradually, a story emerged that no one had heard before. On the evening of September 14, 1986, Jerry had been working late, patching potholes on County Road 15 in preparation for harvest traffic. Around 6:30 p.m., he noticed a blue pickup truck parked on the shoulder near the railroad trestle over the Little Blue River. A man was standing beside the truck, looking agitated and pacing back and forth. I thought maybe he had car trouble, Jerry told investigators, his words coming slowly but with increasing clarity as the memory surfaced. So I stopped to see if he needed help. But when I got close, I could see there was someone in the truck, a young woman. She looked scared. The man, Jerry recalled, was wearing work clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He quickly approached Jerry's county truck and told him everything was fine, that he was just helping his girlfriend with car trouble. Something about the situation felt wrong to Jerry, but before he could process what he was seeing, the man suggested he should leave because they were handling a private family matter. "I should have stayed," Jerry said, tears forming in his eyes. I knew something wasn't right, but I was young and didn't want to get involved in someone else's business. I drove away, and I've regretted it every day since." This revelation prompted investigators to take a closer look at men in the area who would have had both opportunity and means to intercept Becky between Murphy's corner store and the Patterson farm. Detective Martinez created a geographic profile focusing on anyone who lived or worked along that route, cross-referencing with the 1986 investigation files. One name appeared repeatedly in old interview notes, but had never been seriously considered as a suspect: Thomas "Tommy" Brennan, who had operated a small auto repair garage just 2 miles from where Becky's truck was found. In 1986, he had been 35 years old, recently divorced, and struggling financially. Several witnesses had mentioned seeing him in the area that evening, but he claimed he had been working alone at his garage. Tommy Brennan had died in 2003 from a heart attack, but Detective Martinez located his ex-wife, Patricia Brennan, now living in Colorado Springs. Patricia had remarried and built a new life, but when contacted about the Morrison case, she agreed to speak with investigators. The conversation took place over video call in November 2019. Patricia Brennan, now 68, sat in her kitchen with morning sunlight streaming through lace curtains, looking like any grandmother preparing to share family recipes. Instead, she revealed a secret she had carried for over 30 years. "Tommy came home that night different," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were already having problems. The divorce was getting ugly. But that night he was scared, really scared. He kept washing his hands over and over, and his clothes were muddy." She paused, collecting herself before continuing. "Around midnight, he left again, said he had to check on something at the garage. When he came back a few hours later, he had a woman's purse with him. I asked him about it, and he got angry, angrier than I'd ever seen him." He said if I ever mentioned it to anyone, he'd make sure I never saw our kids again. Patricia had filed for divorce 2 weeks later, citing irreconcilable differences, but the real reason was fear. She had hidden the purse in her sister's attic and tried to forget what she had seen. After Tommy died in 2003, she considered coming forward, but convinced herself it was too late to make a difference. "I was a coward," she admitted to investigators. How that poor family spent all those years not knowing, and I could have given them answers. I was so afraid of him, even after he was dead. Patricia retrieved the purse from her sister's attic and shipped it to the Kearney County Sheriff's Department. Inside, investigators found Becky's wallet completely intact, along with appointment cards, family photos, and a small spiral notebook where she kept notes about soil samples and farming recommendations. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source. Dr. Fleming, the FBI behavioral analyst, suggested they examine property records for any land that Tommy Brennan might have had access to in 1986. The search revealed that Brennan's uncle owned a 40-acre farm about 10 miles from the discovery site, land that had been sold to developers in 1995 and was now a subdivision called Meadowbrook Estates. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the area in December 2019 identified several anomalies in what had once been a small grove of trees behind the old farmhouse. On January 15, 2020, Rebecca Morrison's remains were finally found, buried in a shallow grave that had been covered with concrete sometime in the late 1980s. The official cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. Based on evidence found at the burial site and Patricia Brennan's testimony, investigators concluded that Tommy Brennan had likely encountered Becky when her truck broke down or ran out of gas, attempted to assault her, and killed her when she resisted. He had then disposed of her personal belongings in the river, believing they would never be found. On February 14, 2020, Valentine's Day, and what would have been Becky's 57th birthday, Rebecca Morrison was finally laid to rest in Minden Cemetery. More than 800 people attended the funeral, including Marcus Chen, whose discovery had finally brought her home. Danny Sullivan, now 59 and married with children of his own, placed a white rose on Becky's grave before the service began. "I always knew she was waiting for us to find her," he told reporters. Becky never liked leaving people hanging. Even in death, she made sure we got our answers. The case was officially closed on March 1, 2020, exactly 33 years and 6 months after Rebecca Morrison disappeared on a quiet September evening in rural Nebraska. Her story became a reminder that sometimes the truth waits patiently beneath the surface, preserved by time and circumstance, until the right moment arrives for secrets to finally come to light.